Good evening, all. Welcome to the April session of Research Roundtable Online, conducted by the Department of Communication, University of Hyderabad. Today, as our guest, we have Professor Shashanga Pereira with us. Professor Pereira is with the Department of Sociology, South Asian University, New Delhi. He is the founding faculty member of the department. Before joining SAU, he was with the Department of Sociology at University of Colombo, Sri Lanka for 20 years. His research areas include visuality, visual cultures, and ways of seeing. In this session, he will be speaking on the topic Making Photographs Speak, venturing beyond anthropology's fear of the visual. This is the general theme for an introductory commentary on photography's changing relationship with anthropology. It is based on the subjects that he had dealt with in his latest work, The Fear of the Visual, Photography, Anthropology, and Anxieties of Seeing. You can see his selected works in the chat box. Before starting the session, we would like to inform that this is being recorded. We will have a 40 minutes lecture followed by a short question and answer session for 20 minutes. Thank you for joining with us, and over to you, Professor Pereira.
Thank you, Khadija. I am not sure whether, I might make sense to a group of young people in communication. I don't think I'm particularly good at communicating things. But anyhow, the one of the problems I would have today is, I just finished writing a book on photography last year or the year before, I forgot. But when you finish something like this, you also wonder what else is there to say about the subject. So, which is why I decided that I will make it something introductory in the sense that the kind of confusion and anxieties that I had in my own mind, and I thought I will share them with you. And I will do it fairly quickly, and then we can have a conversation. So, I don't know how many of you have read this children's book called Alice's Adventures in Wonderland. Somewhere in it, and this is written by Lewis Carroll, have a look at some point. Somewhere in it, Alice, this little girl, asked this question: what is the use of a book without pictures and conversations? Indeed, I have also wondered often, not unlike Alice, what kind of anthropological conversations might photographs generate if we find ways to give these images a sense of voice and a structure of meaning as part of the anthropological enterprise we engage in. That question, though from a children's book, is a good enough place to begin an inquiry into anthropology's association with photos. Roland Barthes informed us as early as the 1970s, photography mechanically repeats what could never be repeated existentially, and thereby ushering in events, facts, and moments of the past to the present and connecting them with wider realities than those associated with the immediate circumstance of the images themselves. It is in these realms of wider discursive possibilities of photography which I think anthropology should ideally be interested in. What I want to explore today is both fundamental and very simple. That is, given the importance of the captured image of the camera as a possible freezing of history, time, and space, why is it that photography has not been taken very seriously as a legitimate object of research and as a possible repository of information in mainstream anthropology? This question becomes even more intriguing in today's context, where photography has been made both ubiquitous and democratic. Everybody has access to it. To answer this question, I think we need to revisit anthropology's historical affinity with photography on one hand, as well as the discipline's over-infatuation with the written word since the writing culture debate and partial truths debate of the 1980s and after. it is not that anthropology has not been conventionally had an interest in the visual. But the problem has always been, as suggested by David McDougall, what appears to be institutional anthropology's seeming inability to decide clearly what to do with photographs. Similarly, Marcus Banks has observed, paradoxically, while social researchers encounter images constantly, not merely in their own daily lives, but as part of the texture of life of those they work with, sometimes they seem at a loss when it comes to incorporating images into their professional practice. Nevertheless, photos have been present in different ways in the mainstream of anthropological text making historically, almost from the initial beginnings of formal anthropology. When it comes to the use of images, the early anthropological tradition was very much located within the practices of colonial travel literature. As such, when Evans Pritchard published his celebrated ethnography called The Noor, a description of the modes of livelihood and political institutions of a nomadic people in 1940, it contained 41 photographs. These images took the readers visually to those parts of Sudan where Evans Pritchard conducted his fieldwork. As pointed out by McDougall, photographs remained a prominent feature of ethnographies until the 1930s and became less obvious in later times. Let me give you some examples. Now, C.W. Hattersley's The Baganda at Home, published in 1908, presented 80 photographs. Henry Junod's The Life of a South African Tribe, published in 1912, presented 112 illustrations, of which most were photographs. R.S. Rattery's Ashanti, published in 1923, contained 143 images. Comparatively, when Paul Spencer's The Samburu was published in 1965, it only contained 4 photographs, while his Masai of Matapoto was published in 1988, it contained no images at all. So you can see the decline of photography's presence in anthropology, social anthropology over a clear period of time. In general, the practice of using images or particularly photographs in anthropological texts was part of the strategy of enhancing the ethnographic authority of professional anthropologists. But photographs, which had entered the discourse of formal social sciences, mostly through colonial anthropology, were often not used as a self-conscious and carefully designed methodological tool to further the goals of research. Referring to the same period, Christopher Pinney suggests that the anthropological potentiality of photographs was defined partly in the context of early anthropology's anxieties about the truth value of the verbal communications of natives, that is, people like you and us, you and me. Often, without the required language skills to comprehend the local context and suspicious of the ability or the interests of the natives to describe their circumstances accurately, many early anthropologists assumed information gathered from such contexts would be irrelevant or false. In this scheme of things, photography offered a kind of irrefutable and scientifically captured record of facts whose authority was seemingly established. After all, they were bound by time and place and were captured in real time by someone who was right there, as opposed to paintings or engravings that might have been done after an event or on the basis of hearsay. However, in this scheme of things, post or consciously ordered and choreographed photographs had already become a norm compared to pictures of individuals or events that had been made as part of a process of unfolding events at a particular time and a place. If you look at the work of Edward Curtis, his photographs had become legendary due to his extensive attempt to stage manage a romantic representation of dying Native American cultures. I would say the ways in which most published photographs of Indian Maharajas have been structured is very similar. They have been structured, organized, posed, right? Nevertheless, even in the early years of social anthropology, criticisms did emerge over photography's seeming inability to capture the movement and the process of cultural moments. Within this larger context, visual imagery appeared disquieting in the sense they appeared to show everything and yet, like the physical body, remained annoyingly mute. It is in this context that Claude Lévi-Strauss in 1994 dismissed his extensive collection of excellent photographs taken during fieldwork 60 years before that in Sao Paulo and among Amerindian groups as useless, and viewed them simply as void and lack of something that the lens is inherently unable to capture. For him, these photographs were merely silent images, lacking the sense of perfume of the time and the place, which he thought his field notes still contained, even though quite faintly all these years later. Another source of anxiety over photos in social sciences and in anthropology stems from the fact that photographs do not always capture an incident as it happened. Often, photographs are taken after an event, like crime scene photos, which capture the residual by professionals who arrive too late after an incident has actually happened. Images captured by anthropologists and others who arrive at a ceremony, a ritual, or any other event after it has taken place also fall into this category. However, this residuality itself should not become an issue, as far as I am concerned. In such moments also, photographs are taken of a situation which will later be read and situated in a broader socio-cultural, political, and temporal context to make broader sense. In many ways, this is not very different from interviewing a person about an incident that has already taken place. Now, these criticisms miss certain crucial elements of photography's discursive value and its possible methodological implication in anthropology. It almost seems that these criticisms assumed that photography somehow had to narrate a story so authentic, which had to be the ultimate truth, and that it had to be done through images alone. Today, in an era after the writing culture and partial truths debate, initiated by James Clifford, George Marcus, and others in the 1980s, such a sense of privilege is not even offered to the written text in the practice of ethnography. Photographers, like any other source, photographs, like any other source of data and information, cannot simply be understood as irrefutably objective scientific facts. Instead, they need to be situated in a wider context of discourse, informed by temporally bound bodies of information, theory, and interpretation, as would be the case with any other form of knowledge. Now, how can we understand these anxieties? As Marcus Banks has noted, ultimately, good visual research rests upon a judicious reading of both internal and external narratives. The question that has always come to my mind is, are these reading possibilities, the possibility of reading photographs, not offered by the intellectual apparatuses generally at the disposal of sociology and social anthropology, even today, when dealing with photos or images more generally? Internal narratives are provided by the photograph itself. It's within the frame. While the external narratives might have some references within the photograph, but their main sources will be exterior to the photograph and embedded in other domains and contextual material, such as local histories, individual memories, and other temporal resources, which might offer a more nuanced reading of the photograph and its context. This is because, as Banks further notes, at root, all visual objects represent nothing but themselves. Their very existence in the world as material objects is proof of nothing but their autonomy. It seems to me photography's dislocation from mainstream anthropology and sociology has happened due to not asking seriously enough what to do with photographs and how best to utilize them. This is what Elizabeth Edwards wondered when she asked, and I quote, "What work is expected from photographs as objects in albums, on walls, at shrines, in political protests, and as gifts? Under what demand embodied responses, under what material conditions are photographs seen? In which ways are they things that demand embodied responses and emotional effects?" End of quote. Instead of asking under what conditions and how the ways in which photography could drive anthropology and sociology in both methodological and theoretical terms, the mainstreams of these two disciplines have felt more comfortable in allowing that question to be answered as central issues within the subdisciplines of visual sociology and anthropology, rather than as a part of core interests within the mainstream. So my contention is that visuality has not been a core interest in mainstream anthropology for quite some time. So my suggestion is this methodological and intellectual non-engagement with the visual in mainstream anthropology is not based on theoretical or methodological limitations in the discipline itself. Instead, it is based on an unsubstantiated fear of the visual in general that has emerged in recent developments of the discipline over a period of time. In this context, visuals are generally seen as non-objective, soft material as opposed to empirical hard facts. But is it impossible to imagine a broader anthropological approach that would use photographs and other visual material as central points of departure and focus? To put it differently, can issues of caste, nationalism, ethnicity, gender relations, politics of violence, love, leisure, and many other anthropological objects of research not be seen through images as central narrative? In that process, would not images linked to such situations offer responses and emotional effects as suggested by Elizabeth Edwards, and also offered by other methods of research as well? So my sense is this is not only logically possible, but anthropology is already intellectually equipped to engage in this kind of inquiry via photography, which might make nuanced intellectual sense. But it is not, this possibility, it seems to me, has not convinced most practitioners of the discipline. However, as Susan Sontag has noted, a photograph simply cannot provide an interpretation by itself. Now, to me, this should be common sense. Such images have to be given a context, and through that context, a sense of wider relevance and meaning through the work of scholarship. By doing so, scholars are expected to transform such imagery and immediate meanings, often from the realm of relatively private or limited consumption, to the domain of formal scholarship, which would be available publicly and open to debate and fine-tuning. And when I say fine-tuning, I mean further theorization and so on. Now, let me begin to wrap up my thoughts by offering at least a partial explanation for anthropology's fear and anxiety over the visual. Even though anthropology had a close association with photography at the early period of its intellectual development, as I have outlined, its main claim to fame has always been as a way of writing, which is where the word ethnography comes from, right? It seems to me that anthropology has not been able to surpass this long-term obsession with the written word. This is essentially what David McDougall meant when he said that the early interest of visual anthropology, which began with such enthusiasm, gradually faded into perplexity. But more clearly, this fading into perplexity meant the entry of the visual into the subdisciplinary domain of visual anthropology and its almost complete exit from the mainstream of anthropology. Now, despite the discursive possibilities embedded in carefully selected photographs, what is apparent is that photography's presence in mainstream anthropology eclipsed more decisively with the forceful establishment of the literate sensibilities in social anthropology, consequent to the influence of the writing culture debate, particularly in the United States and later in the rest of the world as well. Even much earlier, though, in the 1970s, for example, Margaret Mead, one of the few ardent supporters of photography in modern anthropology, had critiqued it as a discipline of words. Even though the writing culture debate emerged within social anthropology, the power of the written word it championed, accompanied by an embracing of statistics, is similarly seen in sociology as well. This eclipsing has taken place steadily since the 1960s. But rather than a self-conscious expulsion of photographs from the discipline, this has happened more as a byproduct of the emergent theoretical and methodological prerogatives privileging the practice of writing and literary sensibilities in the anthropological practice. As Clifford has noted, writing or making of text is no longer a marginal or an occulted dimension in anthropology, but has emerged as central to what anthropologists do, both in the field and thereafter. So obviously, this does not mean that anthropologists did not write before this. Of course, they did. But compared to these earlier modes of anthropological expression, the dominant post-writing culture anthropological practice saw the emergence of writing as its co-obsessive object. As Marcus writes, anthropologists became more self-conscious than ever before that they were essentially writers. As they become writers, among other things, they discard what was discarded, among other things, included the centrality of participant observation as well as long-term research itself as a more embedded and complex process. This was both a theoretical as well as a methodological reorientation of the discipline at a time many people perceived that the broader theoretical project of 20th century anthropology was in disarray and enmeshed in what was called a crisis. In these conditions, the literariness of published anthropological knowledge became far more important than the process itself, which made this discursive end product inevitable. Seen in this sense, one can generally agree with Marcus that textualization is at the heart of the ethnographic enterprise, both in the field and in university settings like ours. And one of the many victims in this process is obviously photography in particular and visuality more general. So, to put it simply, even though photography was associated closely at the initial stages of anthropology over a period of time, the presence of photography eclipsed from anthropology. And since the 80s, very clearly, the enormous emphasis given to the act of writing in anthropology has also made sure that something like photographs were considered unreliable texts, right? Um, so I think from what I've said so far, my personal position with regard to photography's place in anthropology and its potential must be clear enough to all of you. But clearly, methodological innovations and the selection of research objects in the larger scheme of practice, such as photography within anthropology, cannot be the personal effort of a handful of individuals alone. Uh, that is that just because a few people like me or Christopher Pinney or whoever talks about the usefulness of photography in anthropology, that is not going to become widely accepted. Particularly because when disciplinary perspectives in general, institutional structures, lapses in conventional thinking, and a very short supply of creative imagination in formal academia have placed fairly impenetrable hurdles disrupting possible paths in this direction. Right. So, in other words, I am saying there is extreme conventionalism in our discipline in South Asia and beyond, and therefore, to deal with methodologically and theoretically with something as seemingly subjective as photographs seem to be very nerve-wracking, nervous. So, photographs and interest in photography and visuality have effectively died within the mainstream anthropology by now. And such interests have been reborn within the subdisciplinary domains of visual anthropology and sociology. But insofar as I am concerned, this rebirth has taken place mostly within a cluster of technical interests that have deprived the interpretive possibilities mainstream anthropology and its theoretical enterprises might have otherwise offered. So it is clear that what we are confronted with is contemporary anthropology's methodological conventionalism and reductionist utilitarianism lurking very openly and making a very powerful presence in our universities, publishing forums, and other intellectual domains. In the midst of a fear of the visual, compounded by its obsession with the written text, in a situation where the nuances offered by what was meant by partial truths in that original partial truths debate seem to be ill understood. So I will stop here, and then if there are any conversations, we can go forward. So it's up to you, Khadija, now.
Yeah, thank you for this insightful session, Professor. Now it is time for our question and answer session. You guys can either raise a hand or type out the question in the chat box, whatever is comfortable. Yeah. Devina, can you please go ahead now?
Yeah, sure. I'm so sorry, sir. My camera is off because of bandwidth issues.
All right, David.
But thank you so much for this session, and I'm going to be a little selfish here and workshop my own doctoral work with you right now. So I study young people in the age group of 10 to 18 years and their social media practices. So there's a lot of visual work because social media is all about memes and photographs and short videos these days on platforms like TikTok, etc. Now, coming from a communication background, while adopting an ethnographic approach to my work, I do not necessarily have all the skills that an anthropology student might have to be able to weave in this sort of visual work in my research. So could you give me pointers as to how I can do that successfully? Because you're right, there is a lot of struggle that we have ahead of us, especially in the neoliberal university environment that we're in right now. So over to you, sir.
Devina, my whole criticism is that anthropologists also do not have those skills. That is, anthropologists in the mainstream, right? At least one good thing for you is at least you have an interest in trying to deal with photographs, right? So I consider it as a major achievement. So right now, as far as, except a handful of people whom I may have already mentioned, most people who deal with photographs, are in these subdisciplinary domains of visual sociology and visual anthropology. And my criticism of, these colleagues who are in these areas will probably disagree with me, but my general concern is that these subdisciplines have become far more technical oriented rather than open to, this cannot be generalized beyond a point, but my suggestion is this for you, given your interest. There are a lot of ways in which photographs that are used in social media by young people can be interpreted. If you look at, to me, a photograph will be simply an object, or I would say it will be a text in which certain messages have been embedded, and we have to find a way to decode them, right? So now, if you are looking at ideas like the self, identity formation, networks, notions of friendship, and ideas of privacy, and so on and so forth, then I think social media is probably a very interesting place to begin. And I don't think that that research will be complete if you do not look at photographs. So my suggestion, I have two suggestions for you. There are all these algorithms that you can use, that many people use nowadays when they are dealing with social media research. But I think if you stick to algorithms, then this technicalization of what you can do will become, in my mind, unbearable, right? I think you have to, if you're dealing with photographs, you also have to give it some kind of subjective value. Photographs have value that goes beyond its technical composition. So the only way you can do that is if you look, if you find ways to give, I would say, more nuanced sense of meanings to what photographs are all about, right? Quite a bit of studies are available. I can I can give you some suggestions. I'm a very forgetful person, so it will not come to me now. But if you get my email address from Khadija and write to me, I'll be very happy to send you information. And there are quite a bit of studies, but most of them are these algorithm-based kind of studies, which I don't find intellectually very stimulating. But I will send you the material.
Yes, sir, certainly right to you. It does get to be superficial, especially if you're using algorithms. And if I'm looking at meaning making, and like you mentioned, presentation of the self, it certainly makes more sense to look at it from a subjective, nuanced perspective.
I think so, because I am a fan of subjectivism in a sense. Because, see, one thing that people in South Asia forget often when we are told to be very objective in our research is that debate between subjectivity and objectivity that happened in the 1970s was never really was concluded in any convincing way. And today, if you are dealing with something like social media, the whole sense of being subjective is something you have to take very seriously, isn't it? That's what the whole enterprise is about. So you can't remove it from the equation. Okay.
We have Amrita with us. Amrita, can you?
Yes, Amrita.
Yeah.
Yes. Hi, sir. I hope you can hear me.
Yeah, I can hear you.
Thank you so much for this session, sir, first of all. And I had a few questions, but I don't know if these are like old questions which have been asked before. But still, I'm going to go ahead and ask you. We were just reading Berger's Ways of Seeing recently, and there was this particular statement from Berger that men act and women appear. He says this from taking cue from oil paintings, and then goes on to speak the same about photography. So I was wondering, like, what would be your thoughts on this? Like, that women appear, and when they appear in photography, do you think it's the appearance that is standing out, or is there any agency that is happening within that photograph? Just wanted to know.
No, I mean, I still read Berger. Even for my last book, I did read him. I mean, after all, the man has said a lot about seeing now. But in the same way, I still read Kumaraswamy too, because, again, this is to Devina as well. If you are looking at ideas of the self and the depiction of the self, the portrait, you have to read Ananda Kumaraswamy. That doesn't mean, however, that whether it's Kumaraswamy or Berger, the kind of politics that informed their understanding of things at the time they wrote have to be taken seriously by us. Now, I have serious reservations with both of these people, but I do acknowledge that certain things were imposed on them given the nature of knowledge at the time they were writing. So this particular thing you quoted is something that I think you can safely discard. Because, I mean, to me, even the common sense wouldn't allow us to accommodate something that simplistic, right? So what I mean, particularly because many of you might be graduate students, I will graduate students what in India are called research scholars. I have still not got used to this word. See, one of the things you have to remember is that these people, whether it's Berger or Marx or in another 100 years, whether it's me, you can't take these people literally, right? I mean, if you do that, you become prisoners of theoretical constructs and methodological notions over which you have no control. So all I'm saying is that I find it liberating, even now at this fairly senior age, that one has to be comfortable enough to see what kind of ideas work in your context, right? And this is why I'm also encouraging people to be theoretically innovative. I mean, one of the problems in South Asia, I mean, in India too, is that we are theoretically very, very backward people. Why are you asking me about Berger, for example? That is because in your classes and mine, for example, we do teach Berger. We are not we are not theorizing on our own, right? We are not theorizing in a way that might make more cultural sense in our own context, right? So to me, that lack of innovativeness in theorizing and philosophy is also what is impacting us methodologically, which is why we are not dealing with something like photographs in a much more creative fashion. So I think I've taken your question a little bit out beyond its scope, but I think these are things one has to pay attention to, particularly by people in your generation, right? Okay.
So to just push that question a bit more further. So who would you think would be someone who's doing innovative theoretical conversations in photography? Like whose work do you think?
No, that is precisely my problem. Now I've forgotten your name.
Amrita.
Amrita, sorry. That is my problem. See, See, I like to read. I mean, it's not that I am over enthused by everybody I read, but I will say that I'm intrigued by some people's writing. So, for example, Christopher Pinney, I do like to read the man, right? Because he's one of the very few people who actually spends a lot of time trying to deal with photographs. It doesn't mean that I agree with everything he writes. Okay. Now, you have people like Sarah Pink, who does a lot of visual research. You have people like what's her name, Elizabeth Edwards. But I mean, these are people that I've read and I've learned quite a lot. But then I also see that many of these people are also limited by a certain technical take on things. I'm trying to suggest that, or even John Tagg, for example, I forgot. John Tagg is an interesting writer, but I can send you a lot of this material if you people are interested. You just have to write to me, either the reference or the books. But the problem is that, see, why I was trying to argue that anthropology has to come on board in dealing with photography more seriously is because I think there are quite a bit of interpretive possibilities that have come into the disciplines in the 1980s that can actually make the writings of these kinds of people I mentioned far more reflective. You see, the problem I have is that something like, and this is also the criticism I have of, I don't know how Hyderabad University's, what is it called, the Department of Communication is, but I know that in many other parts of India and in Dhaka, in Bangladesh, and Sri Lanka is a lost case, I think. But what happens is that, these kinds of areas like communication studies, visual studies, and so on and so forth, have become reduced to technical enterprises. Unfortunately, it's about light, color. I'm probably oversimplifying this, but what I'm trying to say is that the interpretive possibilities that should ideally be brought into these discussions, these disciplines, have been left out. Because and partly this has come because of a utilitarian ethos that have been injected into these disciplines, right? Because it's about, in the end, who gets a job in what television station, right? Or what radio station. So that utilitarianism has also impacted the what I would call the theoretical, the thinking edge in these disciplines, which is why I'm always saying, I think even in your kind of discipline, the technical knowledge is obviously necessary. That will probably get you a job. But what is also important is probably that reflectivity, which will probably allow you even to see a technical issue more creatively. Right? And certainly, if you have to come to a university setting to engage in scholarship, then it can't just be these technical things. I think we are becoming imprisoned, and somebody mentioned this neoliberal university system, and this is one of the repercussions, right?
Professor. All right. Who raised the hand? Devina or Samir?
I want to ask a question if I'm allowed.
Yeah, sure. Please go ahead, Samir.
Hi, Professor Pereira. Samir here.
Yes, Samir. Go ahead, please.
Yeah. Sir, I want to understand something which is related to qualitative research in general. And as you said, that we do not come up with our own theoretical framework or ideas, which is new in a way. Like, if I am researching on disability, so I am utilizing phenomenology of perception, right? But I wanted to do something innovative in my research, and I started, data analysis in a very inductive manner, so that I could come up with something new. I have to offer something new to the world of academics. so and social sciences in general. But my problem is because our training has given us certain frameworks to think, like if this is happening, this is this theory. If that is happening, that is that theory. So how we should come, uh, how we should come with something new if we have, consumed so much of theories, and which in a way constrain our thinking in a way. Like I want to innovate, but I'm not pretty sure. And second example, sir, in a way, like me and one of my brilliant friends, she is good with methodology and research thing, but we often get confused between the differences of methodology and method and everything. So, sir, and it further complicates our own desire to contribute something new. So please help me. Like I'm still in a writing process, and I want to understand how I and many people like me can contribute something innovative. Yeah.
Thank you, Samir. I'm so happy that you asked this question. I mean, it's always good when people have doubts. I know for a fact that I can't provide you an answer today, but I can initiate something, right? In a way, see, I'm not advocating an anti-theoretical or totally nativistic kind of approach, and that will be quite scary too. What I'm trying to say is this: that let me answer this in two ways. A critique on engagement with established theoretical positions, as you were saying, that we are all trained in something. I'm sure that you are trained in something very similar to what I was trained in, except that my training was probably long time ago. But we all belong to a particular, what we can broadly say, a kind of a social science and humanities methodological and theoretical paradigms, right? So we are all, we carry that burden, right? Now, to me, as far as I am concerned, to engage with that, to critique that, you also have to be familiar with what you are critiquing, right? And it is only with that kind of engagement that we can offer something else, an alternative. So you have to be familiar with two things: what you are critiquing as well as what you want to introduce. Now, I don't have time today, but maybe at some other time we can talk about it. But in my own university, we started a theory course for the PhD students to precisely do this. I mean, it's a different question altogether whether it works or not, or whether it has worked or not, but at least it was begun, right, to look at these alternatives. Now, to be more specific to you, see, the difficulty is not only a matter of the burden of your own training to be innovative in the sense that you articulated. It is also because in any conventional university system, which I assume yours is can't be different, there is an expectation to produce knowledge within what is known, within what is formal, within what your teachers have been trained, within what you are, within what is in your syllabi, right? So you can't, in that kind of situation, you can't be radical in that sense. But the only way, the only way in which you can begin to be innovative in your methodological or theoretical approaches is you have to self-consciously unlearn quite a lot of things. And I don't think, Samir, that unlearning is necessarily something that you can do within your PhD program. That unlearning is something you have to do on your own. Because after all, if you have to get a degree, you have to write a dissertation in a way that will be accepted by all sorts of people, right? Evaluators and so on and so forth. So this is not only an intellectual question, this is also a very pragmatic question. So my suggestion is that the fact that you are uncomfortable with this is a very good sign. So, but I think this is a kind of conversation that we'll probably have to have in another place with people who feel like you. And I know quite a lot of others in my own university and elsewhere. So that I think that this is a very larger problem, but at least you had that question, which I appreciate. Okay, so I'll leave it at this for the moment. But if there is an interest, we can carry this forward.
Professor, actually, I have a very basic confusion that I encountered while dealing with photographs on the field. So, after listening to you, I feel like can we actually say that anthropology is sort of bringing in a methodological shift on how photographs are being looked at? If so, how do we actually do that? An expressional engagement with the photographs. Can we actually write down what a photograph feels from the feelings or memories that a photograph carry? So, is it really possible for us as researchers to write it down?
See, no, about anthropology, what I said is exactly the opposite. That is mainstream anthropology, right? My whole grouse is that mainstream anthropology to which I belong, there is no interest in photographs. So that interest is only within visual anthropology, which is almost like a very self-contained subdiscipline now, right? They deal with the visuality in general, not only photographs, right? So it has, in my mind, it has been expelled into, photographs have been expelled into the subdisciplinary domain because mainstream didn't want to deal for the reasons that I had explained. Now, the other question is what is far more interesting because, what do you do with photographs? This is the question that Elizabeth Edwards had posed, which I quoted, because what do you do with photographs? There are a lot of things you can do with photographs. And it depends how you look at it. To what extent have you been trained to look at it? And this is why I think that anthropology is my kind of old-fashioned anthropology, old-fashioned in the sense because I was trained in the 80s. One of the things we were trained was to be extremely observant in field situations. So, and I think that level of observation can easily be replicated even in reading a photograph, right? No, when you're looking at a photograph, there are a lot of questions you have to ask before that becomes part of your analysis. Who has taken a photograph? Who has taken the photograph? Who is in the photograph? Where was it taken? For whom was it taken? All kinds of questions like this. And when you have the answers to those things, you will be able to eliminate certain issues that would otherwise crop into it if you are looking at it as a regular viewer. Now, if we look at colonial photographs from from the colonial archive, whether it's India or somewhere else, you will see these great photographs, these Maharajas and all these people who went on the hunt with their dead animals in the background and so on and so forth. So these are not photographs you can read innocently, and nothing is innocent, right? So that is why I was trying to tell in my talk that a photograph cannot speak by itself. You have to situate it in a wider context. This is why I was asking all these questions. Who took it, where, for what purpose, and so on. When you have the answers to that, the story the image tells can be expanded far more reasonably and reliably. Now, even my family photographs, if I look at it now, which I did for my book, there are a lot of things that I can say now about these photographs, which I would never have been able to say as a child when those photographs were taken. There's a picture, for example, of myself very jeans, ill-fitting cowboy jeans, very badly. I mean, they are short. My socks are shown. 2 guns on both sides. Now, I was trying to see guns in the sense of toy guns. No, I mean, so I was trying to see now how on earth would you interpret a family photograph like this if I'm reading, let's say, social history of Sri Lanka in the 1960s. Then I realized a lot of things will be said in that picture. Because 60s and 70s in that country was a time that import restrictions were imposed. So somebody who had access to those clothes obviously had access to people overseas, which is why which is true. I mean, that is how I got them in all those years ago. Now that is an innoxious family picture. But and I gave you just one example. And if you can reread the family photograph in a way that it can narrate aspects of social history, you can do it with any other photograph too. Whether it's a photograph of tribal people, whether it's a photograph of colonial rulers somewhere, or whether it's a photograph of a construction site when the railway lines were set, and so on. So it is not up to the photograph to tell this story. It is up to us to make it speak, right? And to do that, you have to situate it in this wider context, which is why I find these criticisms of photographs being mute very limiting. Because true, they are mute if you are going to take an image seriously for what it is. You have to make it speak. So you have to, this is a discursive thing, right? So you have to situate it in various contexts, in the context of history of the time, the economics, politics, and also politics of the photography itself, right? Okay.
Thank you, Professor. We have our last question of the day from Deepika.
Sure.
Yeah, Deepika, are you able to?
Yeah, can you hear me, Khadija?
Yeah.
Yeah, Deepika, I can hear you.
Yeah, hello, sir. Thank you for the discussion. So I was listening to the talk and the whole discussion which was happening. So I'm thinking like there is something called use of photographs and use of photography, like photographs available with the people in the field, and I as a researcher going to my field and taking photographs. So there are these two set of photographs. So can you comment the value of these two set of photographs? I mean, I'm trying to get what value will my photos have in comparison to the photos available with my people, like whom I'm studying. Can you comment on, or can you?
Okay. No, see, I don't make this distinction in my own work, because these are not the only two distinctions you can make. There are a lot of other distinctions. For example, now you are talking about two kinds of photographs: photos that you capture yourself, and photographs that are in the collections of people you talk to. So those are two. But then there are a lot of other photographs. Photographs that circulate in social media, photographs that are in restricted archives, photographs that are not in restricted archives, and photographs that are taken in leisure. Well, all kinds of things. So now I don't find it particularly useful to make this distinction in general, unless that distinction is useful for your analysis itself, right? Because also there are matters of ethics as well, for the use of photographs as well as the use of anything, right? Now, but right now, so I think your concern should be, depending on the nature of your research, what kind of photographs will, what kinds of photographs. So it would be more than one type that would be of particular use to your study. But also, how do you deal with the ethics of it? I mean, who will be, so my suggestion is that you need to probably start reading quite a lot about whatever little there is on the ethics of visual ethics. There are now, the Visual Anthropology Association has some basic rules, but they are very limited. in the end, one has to use common sense to work out what kind of ethical practices within which you can use images. But these are quite a bit has been written about. Not everything is very convincing, because photographs are very, very commonly available thing. It's because of the nature of the camera now, which is in everybody's phone. None of us can go out into society without being photographed. I used to be very wary of people photographing me. Not that I was a famous person, but I did not like to be photographed. But now there's nothing you can do about it. I go to some place where I want to be left alone. Somebody will click a photograph and put it on social media. I can't even lie, because everybody will know I was in such and such a place. So that level of lack of privacy is also a very important consideration in looking at photographs. So again, if you write to me, I can send you some material that might be very specific. But my final thing is that to make it doesn't make it is not particularly helpful to make these two distinctions only, right?
Okay. Thank you.
Yeah.
I guess that's a wrap for the day. Thank you once again, Professor Pereira, for joining with us. It was indeed interesting to listen to the anxious relationship between photographs and anthropology, and also the multiple ways of taking a look at it, or ways of seeing as such.